All right, welcome to part 3 of our series of using Adobe Illustrator to do precise 3D design. In the first two parts, we went over how I have Illustrator set up. So all of the different panels that I've enabled, we created a new workspace called 3D Design, and it's got everything over here on the right that you pretty much need to do some precise 3D design. And what we mean by that, Illustrator is a 2D vector application, but in something like Fusion 360, you want to do these 2D vector sketches. And when you do these sketches, you can then extrude things into 3D. And if your sketches are set up sort of really well, it makes doing the 3D part of 3D design pretty simple. Found is that Illustrator, if you know it pretty well, or if you get to know it pretty well, you can be really efficient and effective at rapidly moving forward with your 3D designs than you can with the tools in Fusion. So the first part we went over the workspace. The second part we went over the just sort of like setting up your new document when you create one. And so now we're actually ready to create something. So we're going to just start simple with this. We're going to look at a couple of tools, and I'm going to just completely come at this from a practical perspective. So I'm not going to sort of dive into every single tool and what it does, and then you can figure out how it could be used and applied in your situation. We're just going to dive in and we're going to create some things. And so it's definitely a bit of an asterisk or a footnote that, the way I do something, there are probably 10 or 100 other ways to do it in Illustrator. And if you're really good at Illustrator, you should do it your way. So if you're comfortable with it, you should do it the way that you are comfortable with. But I'm going to show you what I do and what I know, and you can see sort of what my process looks like. All right, so let's just dive in. So I thought a really simple thing for us to do was just to create maybe a really simple phone stand. So something that maybe is tailored to my phone. So, you can get a lot of off-the-shelf things or a lot of Thingiverse based phone stands, but I want to just create one really quick for myself, simple design. And we can look at some of the tools that we'll need to do that. So I measured my phone, and it's 150 millimeters tall by about 70 millimeters wide and about 10 millimeters thick with the case. So I've got a little case around it, and so I've measured all of those things. So we can start by actually creating some of the profiles for my phone. So I've got my rectangle tool selected, and I can draw out my 150 by 70, but I'm actually going to just click, and I get this panel here, and it just allows me to specify. So I want a width of, let's have a little bit of an overlap. So I'll give it a width of something like 80 maybe. And we want it to be, maybe doesn't have to be quite as tall, but it's also going to be sort of sitting on a base. So maybe I'll just stick with 150. And then we can have some overlapping on the top. We can always change these things, or we can start again. This is sort of the first iteration of us doing this, and I'm really just doing this kind of on the fly. All right, so this is kind of what the front of my phone looks like, except that it does have some rounded corners. So we can use these smart corners in Illustrator, and we can bring out our rounded corners. Now, I measured, and I would say that the radius for my rounded corners is somewhere between 8 and 10. So I'm just going to maybe do something like a 9. It doesn't have to be precise because I'm not actually modeling this phone. I'm actually just modeling a stand for it. So I just want some sort of representation of the phone. Now I also want to create a profile that is sort of the representation of the side profile of it. And so we said that it has about a width of 10, and again the height of 150. And so we can just kind of see, and there's again a little bit of a rounding happening there that we could just apply there. So this, I may not even really use this to a great extent to design my thing, but it's really nice to kind of build out a reference if you're creating something that to be 3D printed to fit with something else like a phone stand. The phone should go on the phone stand. It's really nice to have this reference so that when you're creating, it can be a little difficult when you have something complex to really scale it up and down. You can do that to some extent, but you kind of want to be creating in the scale that it's going to be in the first place. It just makes things so much easier from start to finish. So here's my phone outline, and I'm just going to start sort of going based on this. I'm going to start thinking about how I want this phone to rest. And I really want to do it from the side because I really think that if I create some sort of profile and I extrude it out it could sort of be the phone stand. And so for my phone stand, I don't want it standing completely vertically. I want it to tilt a bit. Illustrator gives us this nice little hint of how many degrees do we want it at. So maybe something like a 10-degree tilt seems like a pretty nice tilt, something I'll be able to see, maybe closer to 11. Okay, we can also change this here. So I have this selected, and in my transform panel, you can see it's actually got the rotational angle set on it. So if I want that to be a precise 11, I can change that there. And so that's really nice. And now I can start creating my phone stand. So I will grab the pen tool, and I'm just going to do something really simple. So I might not want the stand to completely come up against the phone. And I've got snap to grid on, so you're going to see that this thing is going to be snapping to these little millimeter pixels, because we set up our grid in the last video, how we do that. I want this to have a little bit of maybe a backward angle to give it some support. We want to come down somewhere below, right? I want this to rest flat on the ground, so I'm going to have a straight line here. Now I've got this fill on the shape as I'm drawing it. I can go ahead and go over here and I can switch this out. So now I've got a stroke on it. And so now I can actually see what I'm doing. And I'm just gonna pick maybe this spot here and then come in a little bit and then connect this shape back up at the end here. Now you can see my angle is not quite right. So we can go in here and I can select just this node with my direct selection tool. And I'm using all the keyboard shortcuts, so I apologize, but I just hit A for direct selection. You definitely want to get to know your shortcuts. They just make things go so quick. So I'm switching around between things. I know how to pan, and I can hold spacebar to sort of move my document around. I'm getting a little lag because I'm recording this, but for the most part, you get the idea. So now we've got this nice angle here. We've got this nice part of the base here. We know it's going to sit in a way that I like it. Okay. Now this thing, if we just extruded this out, this would be a big waste of plastic, or we could, have no infill or something like that. But let's finesse it a little bit. Let's actually just give this a little bit of a thickness, so it's more of an outline. But before we do that, let's maybe give this some nice fillets or curves using these smart corners. So I can bring this one down to sort of a full semicircle. Maybe these two at the bottom I want to be equal. So I'm holding shift, I'm using my direct select tool, I'm just clicking on the nodes that I want, and then I can bring both of them in as much as I want. And again, you can see I get a little hint as to how much am I pulling in. It might be hard to get some round numbers. So if you don't get those round numbers, you can change them over here in the properties panel. You can see the corners, these smart corners. So I could say maybe I want a 5mm corner there, right? Same thing for this. Maybe I want this to be 2.5, right? And again, another little one here, maybe 2.5. Okay, so we've got some nice round corners on our phone stand. Now, the next piece I want to show you, this is the #1 sort of feature that I use in Illustrator to create 3D things, and that is the offset path tool, or really command. You have it here when you select a shape. You have it here in the quick actions under the properties panel. You also have it under object, path, offset path. Now, one thing to note with default Illustrator settings, there is no keyboard shortcut for this tool. You have to either go through the menu, or you have to have this properties panel open to access it quickly. And so I have actually gone into keyboard shortcuts. You can go to edit, keyboard shortcuts. Really quick, I'll show you how to do this. Tools to menu commands, search for offset, and then you see offset path, and there will be nothing here, and you can set your own shortcut in here. So I've done it. I've set Command Option Shift O, and I have gotten very intimate with that shortcut that allows me to do really rapid design things. And so this is really good because often in designing for 3D printing or designing to create anything to fit into anything else, you're often doing a lot of offsets, and the offset path is a great way to do offsets, obviously, for things to sort of fit together, to have your tolerances set correctly. So it really allows you to finesse those tolerances in a really precise way. Okay, so let's create an offset. So I'm going to do Command Option Shift O, which is the shortcut that I set. And we can click on Preview. I wish Preview was on by default, but it's not. So we can click Preview, and then you can start playing with some values. So I don't want to hit Enter, but if I hit Tab when I set a value, it'll update the preview. And you can see that it's actually offsetting it outward, which is not such a bad thing. It looks pretty good. I might actually want that. I can adjust the phone, but we can also do a negative value, and we can see it offsets it inward. And so we can get some really, it makes sure that all the way around this path, there's always a 4mm gap between the two lines. And so that's really nice. It's really hard to get when you scale things up and down. So if I were to just duplicate this path and then scale it down, I'd have a really hard time getting all of the path to be equidistant from the other path. So offset is it's way easier to use than scaling things. Okay, so offset is set. Let's actually go with that positive 4mm. That looked pretty nice. I like the look of it. We can say okay. I can sort of update the view here of what my phone is going to look like. I'm using the arrows because it's a little easier to get it in there. Okay, so that's kind of what it's going to look like. That was really simple, right? Because this is the first time that we've really looked at doing anything in Illustrator for precise 3D design. So really simple project to try. You could create just about anything this way. Just a really simple 2D profile that we can extrude out, and we're going to get a nice little product here. So the last thing that we need to do is we need to actually get this into Fusion. And so let me show you my process to get this into Fusion. So the first thing I do usually is I move this thing up towards the top left of the artboard, and that is because in Fusion, the top left of the artboard in Illustrator is the origin point in Fusion, at least when you're putting something on a ground plane. And so putting it here, I know it's going to end up in the center of my document, but this comes in real handy when you're actually needing to bring something in that's going to maybe need to interact with something else that is already aligned somewhere to the origin. So you'll be able to do that because you have this reference point. All right, so let's get through this quick. So I have my item selected that I want to export. I go to File, Export, Export As. Let me grab my window. It's off screen. There it is. Export As. By default, it might want to save as a PNG. I want to change this to a DXF. So you can save as a SVG, but I've had issues, and they happen sporadically. I've had issues with scaling in saving SVGs from Illustrator to Fusion. And I found that using the DXF format, you get a much more reliability in scaling one-to-one, making sure what you've designed and to the scale that you've designed it in Illustrator is going to come out properly in Fusion. So a DXF is what you want. Let's call this phone stand. We'll hit export. And then we get this export options. And this is important. So there are a couple of different ways to do this. We could leave this the same here and change some things in Fusion, but I've gotten so used to it. I changed this to inches in Illustrator. I set the scale from 1 inch equals 1 unit. I set it to that. And yes, you have to do this every time. I haven't figured out how to get this to be the default, but I basically has become muscle memory. You set it every time like this. The other thing that you might need to select, but you don't have to continue to select it, it'll stay as the default once you do, is export selected art only. And that is so that you can have a whole bunch of designs on your artboard, but really the only thing that's going to come out in this file is what you've selected. So that's really nice for like rapid prototyping. You could have 5 different designs that you want to try out, and you can export each one individually without having a different file. So that's really great. All right, so we'll say okay. And then we've saved it. So we'll hop on over to Fusion. So now we're in Fusion, and we can go to, we have a new document open. We can say Insert, Insert DXF. We'll click the plane we want. We want the ground plane. We'll select our DXF file. And here we are, we're already in the folder where we saved our DXF. So we'll choose phone stand, we'll say open. It'll take a couple of seconds. Okay, so it brought that in. It looks pretty good, and it's as a sketch. We don't have to change anything here. So because we set it up the way we did in exporting it in Illustrator, we don't have to change the units. We don't have to mess with anything. There are some things you can do with this insert mode, but we'll look at that later. So we'll say okay. And now we've got our sketch. And so really all I have to do now is I select the portion of the sketch that I want to extrude out. I'll hit E for extrude. And then we said our phone is about 70 millimeters wide. Maybe we want it a little wider, so we'll do 80. And we'll say okay. And voila, we have our phone stand, and it's in an orientation that's probably pretty good for 3D printing. All right, so that was really simple tutorial on how to design, pretty precisely. We didn't have any really major constraints in this example, but we saw that we could get the sizes and the values that we wanted. We did it really rapidly, and just with a couple of tools in Illustrator, you're able to do a pretty robust design and bring it into Fusion really quickly.